Okay, so today we're picking up with the first global age, which is going to look at the relationship between Europe and Asia and how they begin to first interact. It all begins with the search for spices. Pepper at this time was almost as valuable as gold as a spice in order to make food taste better. By the late 1400s, there is a very rich spice trade that is going on, and that's because the Europeans are beginning to explore. The Europeans begin to take to the sea. They had been trading with Asia before the Renaissance, and we know this because of the Crusades and because of people like Marco Polo, and because things like the Black Death happened. This happened because there was trade going on, that the disease was spread more easily along the trade routes. So we know that trade was going on. However, all of these things, the Crusades and the Black Death, are going to disrupt those trade routes from time to time as well. So having a steady supply wasn't always there. So by the 1400s, the Europeans were recovering from the plague. Their population begins to increase, and when you have an increased population, you have increased demand for goods, especially for those exotic Asian goods, things that were different. The most valuable trade at this time was the spice trade. And so they were looking for things like pepper, but they were also looking for cinnamon and cloves and all kinds of preservative sort of spices. And that's because there's no refrigeration at this time. They don't have electricity, they don't have any sort of way to really keep food fresh, and food would spoil. So you found a way to make it either last longer with the use of like salt and that kind of stuff, but like cinnamon and cloves act as a preservative, a natural preservative, and food lasts longer. And so they would be preservatives, but they also would add flavor to food that was kind of bland and kind of tasteless for the most part. But these spices were also used in medicines as well as perfumes. Remember, they didn't bathe all that often back in the 1400s, so you wanted to cover or mask that body odor. So there's several different motives for why they're going out and exploring and trying to get in on the spice trade. First off, they want to cut out the Muslim and Italian middlemen. They want to have direct access, because if it goes through 2 or 3 people first, each one of them is going to incur costs, and so then it will disrupt or add more cost to your product. You don't want that to happen. For some, it's a way to get rich quick, because you could make a hefty profit off of some of these things. And for others, it's pure adventure. It's a way for them to learn more about other lands and to experience other cultures and all that kind of stuff. Well, the reason they're able to do this so much more readily in the 1400s or during the Renaissance, right after the Renaissance period, is because of the improved technology that was available. You will have cartographers, and a cartographer is a map maker, and they began making more accurate maps and more accurate sea charts, so that way you kind of had a better idea of where you were going, and you weren't going to run into problems like rocks or shallow seabeds and that kind of stuff. Another instrument that's going to help is the astrolabe, and the astrolabe is an instrument that is used to determine your latitude at sea, which is important for the Europeans, because if you have to go around Africa, you need to know how far south you're going. So latitude is knowing how far north and south. Longitude is east and west. So they want to know the latitude of where they're at, so it gives them an idea of where they're located. Another one is the compass, and the compass helps to determine direction. That's always a good thing. You want to make sure you're going in the right way. And then finally, the caravel. And a caravel is a ship that is going to combine the square sails of the European ships with the Arabian triangular ones. Now, the nice thing about combining these two different kinds of sails, a square sail is going to capture the wind better, and a triangular one is actually going to make it easier to sail across the wind. So if there's a wind coming at you, you can sail into it and not have as many problems. So having this combination means that you're not going to get stalled in the water, which is a good thing, because otherwise you run out of supplies, or you could run out of fresh water, or somebody needs medical attention. So it's good to be able to move at all points, no matter if you have a wind behind you or not. So it is easier to sail across or into the wind with these sails. They also will begin to add armaments, which means like cannons and guns and stuff, because they're going to need this because other people are going to try and take their money or take their spices away from them, because it is such a lucrative trade. You're going to be making lots of money from this. So the Portuguese are going to be the pioneers of the spice trade. They're going to be the first ones going out. Portugal's just a very small nation on the western edge of Spain, but it is going to be the one that leads the way in exploration, probably because it doesn't have a lot of resources itself, so it needs to find a way to make money or to become more rich and powerful. So they begin by mapping the coast of Africa. Their Prince Henry, who is also called Henry the Navigator, is hoping to find the source of African gold as he is exploring the coast of Africa. And so he's going to send out ships to explore the coast of West Africa, and as they're going along, they're mapping the territory, so they're getting a better acquaintance of what it's like. Now, Henry dies later on, but the Portuguese are going to continue their quest for more knowledge about the world, as well as trying to find like the source of the African gold or find a better way to get to those spices in Asia. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias is going to be a Portuguese sailor who is going to round the southern tip of Africa, kind of by accident. It's during a storm, so he doesn't actually realize that he's doing it, but he goes around the southern tip of Africa, and the southern tip will be called the Cape of Good Hope, because it's during a storm, so they were very worried about, where they're going, so it was good hope that they would get around undamaged and all kinds of stuff. But it opens up a sea route to Asia that they had been previously unaware of. So this is going to allow more access to that way. Well, once you get around Africa, you can then go on to India. And Vasco da Gama is going to round Africa, and he reaches the port of Calicut, which is in India, after about 10 months. Now, this is a much longer journey than he was expecting, and so it takes a heavy toll. In fact, he loses about half of his ships because of this trip, various dangers along the way. So he loses about half his ship. So you would think that it's kind of an unsuccessful journey. However, because he loses these ships, many of his sailors are going to die due to hunger because there's not enough supplies on board, because some of those ships go down. They die due to thirst because there's not enough fresh water, and some just due to disease. But even with all this loss, he loses half his ships and he loses most of his sailors, it's still a highly profitable trip for him. Da Gama actually profits about 3,000% on this, which is pretty amazing considering how much he lost. He still comes out making 3,000% on his investment. So, like you can see, it's a huge investment, but it's also well worth it if you can get there and get these spices. So Portugal's doing super well, and as a result, Spain is going to enter the race because they want in on this too. And so in 1480, an Italian navigator approaches the Spanish royalty, and at first he had gone to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese said, nah, we don't really need you. So he went to the Spanish, and this is Christopher Columbus. He is refused by the Portuguese, and then he goes on to the Spanish. Now, it's kind of interesting because everybody assumes at this time that the people of this time period didn't realize that the world was round. Well, for sailors and for the educated, they actually did know that the earth was probably a sphere. It's what made sense. For the uneducated and for the non-shipping folk, that was what they thought. They thought that, you'd sail off the end of the earth kind of thing. But for people that were working on the ocean, it was not a surprise to them at all. They knew this. They just hadn't really written it down or talked about it. It was just kind of an assumed knowledge. Anyway, so Christopher Columbus goes out on this journey with the backing of the Spanish, and he goes on several voyages. And in 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain are going to give him the backing that he needs to get his ships together. The problems that he is going to encounter, he has two problems that he basically encounters. The first is that he underestimates the distance that he's going to be going in order to reach the he's aiming for India. He wants to get to the Indies, and he thinks going across the ocean rather than around Africa is going to be way easier. But he underestimates the distance, and the second problem is he didn't realize that there was 2 continents in his way. Nobody knew they were there. So, but his motives basically, and the Spanish motives, were to, they wanted to get money. They wanted their wealth now. They wanted to spread Christianity, and in doing so, they would beat back the Muslims and their influence in Africa and Asia. And so he's going to get money, but he's also going to spread Christianity and to help out the Spanish. So he's got multiple reasons why he's going. But like I said, he eventually runs into these other 2 continents, and he founds the Indies, and he returns a hero. It's not until later that he realizes that he found a new continent, that it was an entirely new piece of land. So eventually what happens is that Spain and Portugal are going to claim areas that Columbus explored. Sometimes he had the backing of the Portuguese, sometimes he had the backing of the Spanish, and sometimes the Portuguese went on their own, and sometimes the Spanish went on their own for their own journeys. But eventually what they have to do is they have to come up with a line of demarcation, which basically says this land is Spain's and this land is Portugal's. And the reason they had to come up with this line of demarcation is that the Spanish and the Portuguese are fighting back and forth, and this is causing a problem for the Catholic Church because both countries are Catholic, and both sides are trying to get the Pope to side with them. And he doesn't want to pick a side because he doesn't want to alienate an entire country. So in 1493, Pope Alexander VI is going to set this line of demarcation that's going to keep the peace. And so he basically sets up 2 zones. He draws a line, and it's a longitudinal line, so it's going from north to south, okay? So it's a longitudinal line. And he sets the east side of the line would belong to Portugal, and the west side of the line would belong to Spain. Now, it was unknown at this time the amount of land that was available behind this line of demarcation. So actually, Spain gets the better end of the deal. But at the time, for what they had explored, they didn't know all the rest of it was there. So it kind of made sense. Anyway, so naming this new world, because you couldn't name it India Part 2 because it's not really India. But it will be named after an Italian sailor called Amerigo Vespucci. And he never actually went to America. He didn't discover anything in America. He was just an Italian sailor. And the reason the Americas are named after him is that a German cartographer, which is a map maker, had read reports by him, and the name is going to stuck. He's just going to call it Amerigo's land, and Amerigo becomes America, and eventually we get North America and South America. And so that is how the Americas are founded, or not founded, but are found, and will eventually get started. And then our next video, we're going to be looking at how the Europeans gained some footholds in Asia and India, and how that will impact those cultures.